Ontology. It's such a complicated thing to talk about. This talk on ontology is part of the complexity series that I'm thinking of developing. And the first will be this one on ontology, then to look at questions of epistemology. We could also look at axiology, of course, which concerns the nature of values and ethics, and then possibly one on contradiction. So let's start with complexity because it's quite a particular thing and it sets up all these tensions around misapprehensions about some societies being more complex than others. And my argument here is that some societies are more complex in different ways. That is, tribal and customary societies are incredibly complex, but they do not have the contradictions and they do not have the range of ontological orientations that, say, modern or postmodern societies have. And so, in effect, when we're talking about complexity, we're just trying to understand the nature of complexity. So this particular talk is around just framing the basics of ontology. What I want to do is firstly ask the question, what is ontology? Trying to make sense of this incredibly complex area. And you can actually do it quite simply, although um, in the explaining, sometimes it'll appear a bit difficult and sometimes it'll be a bit hard to follow, but I'll try and keep it to a quite structured format. So the first question is, what is ontology? The second, I want to provide a couple of illustrations of the use of ontological analysis, namely the way in which you could use an understanding of ontology in your work to think about what it means to live in this world. And I'm going to take two examples. One is the naming of the Anthropocene, and the second is the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. Now, they're very different things, but you can actually use ontological analysis to look at both those. Thirdly, I want to outline something which is quite hard to understand, but I'm going to take you through it in a very direct and I think hopefully clarifying way. The ontological turn, as it's called in the humanities and social sciences. It's where ontology came in as a thing which people wanted to talk about. And you'll see the word ontology everywhere. This is part of that ontological turn towards looking at the nature of existence. And then fourthly, in the last part of this talk, I want to set up an alternative approach to understanding ontological formations. Now, this is part of the work I've been doing for years and years, and it may not be any use to you, but it may be helpful to thinking about the things like what is modernity? What is postmodernity? What are these things called ontology and how can we understand them? So let's start with part one. What is ontology? Well, ontology concerns the nature of existence. That is, it's the meaning of everything or anything. It's very broad. It's the meaning of what it is to be. So you'll find we use being or be as coextensive with the term ontology, as opposed to epistemology, which concerns the nature of knowledge. We can then quickly ask the question and perhaps answer it. What is the relationship between those two key concepts I've just first raised, ontology and epistemology? Well, put most simply, they're actually bound up with each other. They're intricately braided together. The first ontology refers to being, and when I use this term being, it's different to some other approaches, but I mean being in the sense of the existence of a thing, the existence of a body, the existence of humans beings. And the second concept, epistemology, refers to knowing. And here, knowing includes knowing about being. Now, that would become an important, perhaps if we get on to the question of epistemology in another talk, but that's not important for the moment. So what do we make of this? How do we start? And this is quite difficult to start with the question of ontology. I'm going to start with a particular series of initial claims. And the first one is being, but also knowing, a plural. There's not just one way of being. There's lots of different ways of being and knowing in the world. That is, there are different patterned forms of ontology in different times and places and for different purposes, different persons, for different people as they do different things. So let's take the notion of a contemporary person versus a medieval person. Here I'm doing different times in history, of course. A contemporary person will tend to be, this is the dominant form, ontological form, they'll tend to be modern, postmodern. They'll tend to be a person who thinks in terms of progress, freedom, time moving forward, those sorts of things. Whereas a medieval person living in a different time, but that's not the issue here. The issue is the medieval person is ontologically framed differently. They won't be living in ideas of progress and modern time. They won't be living in the idea of the differentiated body where you make of yourself as you want to be. A medieval person, unevenly and differently in different parts of that medieval period, will tend to be framed by the dominant idea of cosmological time, of time as located in God's presence, time as located in the way in which you can understand your place in the world. So, in a sense, what I'm saying, being is plural. It's different in different places at different times. And the second point I want to make, just to start off with, being and the different forms that it takes can be understood in terms of different categories of existence. And when I use the term categories of existence, I mean things like time, space, embodiment, also other things like performativity, different forms of performativity. You perform yourself differently in these different ontological frames, or subjectivity or objectivity. There are different things, but I'm going to take time and space and embodiment. And in fact, I'd also include epistemology. That is, it is a category of existence. To know is to be part of existence, but that doesn't mean that existence can be prioritized in terms of your knowing. In fact, the other way around, your being determines how you know. So we'll come back to that. There are different types of these. And if you take those different categories of existence like time, what I'm really saying, therefore, there are different forms of time, different ontological forms of time. So that's different from saying a contemporary person versus a medieval person. That's saying that in the present contemporary, you can have customary time, which is what some people in Australia call dream time, or modern time. And they are very different times. The dream time is not just circular time. We'll come back to that perhaps, but it's time which brings together past, present, and future into the singularity of story, or the singularity is the wrong word, the multiplicity of storytelling within the singularity of a person in relation to others. So we'll come back to that as well if we have time. Now, that means that simple point is really to be taken to the fore. They can be understood, being or ontology can be understood in terms of different categories of existence, such as time, space, and embodiment. The third point is that different ontological forms can exist at the same time in the same person. So if you take that thing I mentioned before, that entity called a contemporary person, we don't know what that means until you spend time with them, you interview them, you work out who they are. So a Muslim woman from Western Sydney, it could be caught in a world between traditional understandings of the self and modern understandings of the self. But they also could be secular Muslims. They could be, so therefore they're dominated by a modern sense of the self. An Aboriginal person from Yolngu country in Arnhem Land, exactly the same. There are multiple senses in which that person moves through ontological difference. They could be a customary person for the purposes of doing ceremony, being on country. Then they can get a plane to Melbourne and they can work perfectly well in modern time because they know how to translate between those different forms of temporal being. So the key point there is that different ontological forms can exist at the same time in the same person. So, and I'll come back to this later, but what I'm talking about is ontological formations, and I'll come back and talk about those later. What we're doing now is just slowly edging our way towards defining the meaning of ontology. There's another way of doing it, and I've tried to do it through examples, but sometimes that doesn't help. Another way to do it is just look at the etymological meaning of these terms. The suffix for ontology, but also for epistemology, is derived from the Greek term logos, logi, logos, meaning the word or a corpus of stories. Keep that in your mind. This is actually quite important, and it'll become much more important as I begin to develop this story of different ontologies. They are stories about difference. They are foundational, existential difference. So the ont, in ontology, comes from the Greek on, meaning being. So the Latin equivalents of that are sort of ons, ont, essence, which becomes being, which are the sources from Latin into English of the words like entity and essence. So being, entity, essence are bound up with each other. And what we're doing is, in fact, trying to get out of an essentialist position to talk about the nature of social being and different across different times and places. Now, the meaning of this morpheme has a fascinating twisted history. And this is what makes the word so hard, because the word ontology is used differently in different settings. So in religion, this is probably the first major use of the concept of ontology. It comes through a metaphorical abstraction from the Greek. And I said the Greek idea of the logos, the word, or the corpus of stories. What the Christian tradition does with the term ontology is equate it with a capitalized logos, Logos. This is logos is God. This transcendental existence, and it's expressed in some of the various gospels. So John, this is coming from the first words of John's gospel. He says, "In the beginning was the Word." And what John is doing there, the gospel writer John, is saying God is there before time. He frames, I use the word he, that's the wrong word, of course. There's no gender to God, but that's the way in which conventionally it's been used in Christianity, because they anthropomorphize God as a being with a masculine form. Now, that religious use then gets transposed into lots of things, but that's a traditional understanding of ontology. The philosophical use of ontology is to link the concept of onto, being, and episteme, knowing. And what they're doing is describing a series of metaphysical questions about existence. So the philosophical use of ontology means it's asking questions like, what is a thing? What is existence? What is the nature of reality? How do we know that things exist? Does God exist? So in a way, the philosophical use abstracts from the religious use and stands outside it, beyond it, looks down upon it, and says, what is this thing called God? What is this thing called existence? There's also computer science use, and this is the most banal one of all, but it's still a term that's in the lexicon, so I'll bring it to you. It's the formal naming and definitions of categories or properties or relationship between concepts. So to give you an example, what is an author? If you use the term author in language, it'll be in the context of a sentence, but a computer doesn't understand a sentence. It understands particularities of this or that meaning, on and off switches. So an author has to be defined in terms of, is it a writer or a creator or a storyteller or a composer, or all those sort of things that an author could be. So an ontology is the list of concepts that computer science specialists develop definitions for to tell a computer how to understand what that word called author is, or what every other word is. The fourth one, and this is the one which I'm going to focus on today, is the sociological or anthropological use of the term ontology. Really, it relates to the whole of the humanities and social sciences, although sociology and anthropology tend to use it for the most part. And it's a modern appropriation of the philosophical form, which takes the term logos to denote the study of. So you get concepts like lexicology, which is the study of words, or biology, the study of life, or geology, the study of how the earth is formed, and so on. So the ology part in ontology is taken to be simply the neutral study of social and natural being. It's a study of human existence. If that's the core of what I'm doing today, I want to just add one more dimension to it, which is the critical social theory use of it, which is not quite the same as the sociological use of it. It's the study of existence as a way of understanding the human condition critically in all its contradictions and tensions and all its differences. And the key figures here are somebody like Martin Heidegger. I'm thinking of his book Being in Time from 1953. What he's doing there is searching for the meaning of being, which allows for all the variability of human being, but it's the meaning of being. So he develops concepts about being in relation to time. And the other one, probably just as famous, although not this particular book, is a book called Ontology and Dialectics from 1961. Theodor Adorno is part of the Frankfurt School. He's a massive critic of Heidegger because what Heidegger is trying to do is develop a general approach to being, whereas Adorno is really saying ontology can only be understood through dialectical thinking, that is, thinking through the patterns of history. Now, I don't find Adorno very convincing on one way, and I find Heidegger so difficult and hard to work through, and so essentializing in the way in which he does it that I find it also unhelpful. But what they both do, this is the key point, what they do is they bring ontology into the world of social relations and away from metaphysics. So it's away from the world of religion and it's away from the world of philosophy, because that's the metaphysical understanding of ontology, which just will ask the question, why do we exist? So I'm less interested in the question of why do we exist in that metaphysical sense, and more in the question of why do we exist in the sense of what does it mean for someone to exist now? Or what does it mean to someone to exist in the medieval period? Or what does it mean for a person to negotiate who they are with the complexity of postmodern media, social media barrages? What does it mean to exist in capitalist world? What does it mean to exist when you think about the place in the world? And both Heidegger and Adorno take us in that direction. So over the course of discussion, I'm going to try to elaborate on a series of different ontological and social theoretical approaches. But I want to emphasize that understanding ontology concerns understanding social practice. We're not doing the universalistic philosophical take on the concept. We're trying to do how do you understand social practice and meaning. So let me give you a couple of examples. This is part 2 then of the talk. This is the illustrations of the use of ontological analysis. It comes in as a kind of abstraction from empirical analysis, where you're just getting the facts, the data, and so on. Because all that data, those facts, always framed ontologically. You can think you're saying something neutrally, but even the claim to be neutral is an ontological claim which comes from being modern. Nobody else claims to be neutral. The customary people don't claim to be neutral. Traditionalists never claim to be neutral. It's only modern people who are looking for neutral, more abstract ways of understanding the world. And the postmodernists, they certainly don't claim to be neutral either. So I'm going to use the naming of the Anthropocene as an example of that. Now, the interesting thing here, and we're looking at the ways in which Anthropocene is named and defined. You'll know, of course, the International Commission on Stratigraphy has formally rejected the concept. Now, there's an irony. It's been discussed for 20 years, and it's now so central to the world of the social sciences and humanities, where we want to understand what it means to talk about the Anthropocene, where the Anthropocene is defined as where humans have a constitutive impact upon the world. Now, this is really what I'm saying about, I'm defining it this way. And the Anthropocene can be defined most directly as the period in which humans have constitutively changed the ecology of the planet. Now, this in some ways takes it away from the Commission on Stratigraphy, because what it's doing is saying it's not any old change which makes a difference, and it's not even layering it in the rocks, which the geologists are looking for. It's saying what has changed the nature of the planet And my argument, as many others would argue, is that humans have changed the nature of the planet. And I'm going to argue they have done so in two ontologically different ways. So when the Commission adjudicates, it adjudicates on 4.5 billion years of planetary history. So they're abstracting the meaning of living on the planet to the view from nowhere, if you like, the sort of modern timeline which you can track in an abstract way, and you can say this point in time marks when the Holocene starts, or this time might have marked when the Anthropocene starts. And they're saying from this modern nowhere time, they're saying human impact is too, and this is their terms, temporally variable and too time transgressive for the period to be called the Anthropocene. So given the definition I've just put, that is constitutively change the nature of the planet, we can actually very quickly go to an ontological analysis of this. Have humans ontologically shifted the nature of the planet? We can do that very simply. So you can start to add up quantitative impact upon the planet, not just doing it pretty simply, but carbon emissions or concrete laying or microplastic dispersal are examples of this kind of modern cumulative impact. Small accretions, which then become massive, and they produce in the end, and you know the figures, but we have produced more material globally, and I mean the embodied materiality of that stuff that's on the planet, than the biomass of the surface of the planet itself. Biomass meaning the organic matter on the planet. So humans have manipulated things like asphalt and concrete, which now weighs more than all the trees and grasses and all the microbes that have been developed, all the biomass that's on the planet has been outweighed by our concrete laying. That's a massive change. And if you cannot see that as having an impact on the planet, there's something wrong. It's a qualitative. And there's lots of examples of that which I could add in. I mean, one of the things which is a very simple process at the moment is that we are extracting groundwater. And just by pumping out that groundwater in massive amounts, incrementally, the qualitative has become a description of what was just a quantitative change, because we're now shifting the axis of the Earth by all that movement of water. And this is what I'm describing as a modern ontological change. But you can also see that we've made changes to the planet which go beyond even that. Now, what can go beyond that? What can constitutively change the planet rather than those incremental massification processes? What I'm suggesting is the development of nuclear regimes or bioengineering or nanoscale manipulation. These activities are things which are very difficult, they're non-palpable, it's hard to measure them, but they are changing the nature of nature. That is, humans with, say, nuclear energy and the idea that you split atoms are now entering into changing the very building blocks of nature, atoms. In gene manipulation, the building blocks of organic matter. We're now making life. We can now produce life as scientists. And that kind of world is a world which starts to relativize ontologically the nature of nature. Now let's do the same thing. It's a completely different example, and it's a horrific example. It's the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. What is happening there? Well, I'm not going to try and do a full-blown ontological analysis, but I'll show you the complexity of that thing and how it's being defended. So I'll just use one example from Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a modern secular politician. Ontologically, he is dominant in his modernness. He is a modern person. He's not traditional at all, certainly not customary or tribal. But at the same time, he speaks the language of a different ontology, a traditional cosmology of Hebraic tradition. Now, I'm going to take some very words which are so complicated, it's unbelievable, but he knows that they're complicated. And this is his manipulation of language. His words. You must remember, and I'm quoting here, what Amalek has done to you, says our holy Bible, and we do remember. Now, in some people's understanding, this is a a call to genocide. Because Amalek is a period in the Bible, it's the Leviticus and those. So Amalek were a people of the southern Negev desert who were seen as affronting the Jews after the Exodus from Egypt. And God speaks to the people of Israel and says, the Amalek have to be destroyed because they're going to dominate you. They have to be destroyed. Now, the word destroyed is arbitrary, of course, but it does say destroy their women and children, their men, their suckling pigs. So it's not as if we're talking here total retaliatory destruction. But what he does, this is what Netanyahu does. He instrumentalizes, modernizes the ancient creed, which talks about that destruction. Now, in the cosmological stories of the Jewish Bible, the Amalek might have been the people to attack the Jewish people after Exodus. But when the Bible takes that on, it's got a kind of open ontological form to it, which means that it's treating it as herem in the Jewish tradition. It can be read as a brutal command to genocide, or it can be read more allegorically, more metaphorically, in the traditional sense, as a call to name them as evil, or to treat them as an archetype of evil, and we must rebel and destroy evil both in ourselves and in them. So across the centuries, Jewish scholars have been grappling with this passage. And so it's a controversial passage. Some avoid it in horror, and some suggest it's allegorical, and some point to the final act that will occur out this as outside of time at the end of history, cosmological time. And they're saying, we will defeat the Amalek, evil, at the end of history, in cosmological time, not in modern time. It's the thing. Now, what's happening here is that Netanyahu is being an all too clever rhetorician. He's whistling variously, the dog whistle, to different ontologically variable sensibilities. Each year in the Jewish calendar and the Sabbath before Purim, the passages which are called Parashat Zachor, this is referring to the Amalek, they're read. For some Jews, it's completely confronting their own evils, their own injustices, and they're seeking reconciliation. For others, it's a call to always seek the destruction of those who will destroy the Jewish people. So you get these both sensibilities at the same time. An intersection of ontological forms, as I would argue, which means that the argument that it's genocide has to be taken much more carefully than some of the critics of Palestine. I actually think what's happening in Palestine is worse. I think it's extermination rather than genocide, but that's neither here nor there for the purposes of the discussion. So let's move to part 3 of this discussion, which is explicating the ontological term. And what I'm going to argue through this is it starts really instructively and creatively and well, but it develops increasing problems. So across the last couple of decades, bringing these questions of ontological difference to the fore has become fundamental to a range of disciplines. But the genealogical turn, or the ontological turn, can be traced most graphically, I think, in anthropology, because you can see the lines of it most clearly. So you might not recognize these figures I'm going to talk about, but for those who work in anthropology, it'll be comfortable. And for those of you who don't, then I'll try and make clear what they're doing. The first figure I'm going to talk about is a French anthropologist called Claude Lévi-Strauss. He provides one of these early markers in the development of understanding ontological and epistemological difference across human society. And there's a book called The Savage Mind. I have a copy in the other office, and I would have bought it and showed you and taken you through it. But the key thing that he's doing in The Savage Mind, particularly in the first chapter, and really you only have to read chapter 1, because the rest of it develops beyond it, but it doesn't do anything more than I'm doing here. He says there are 2 modes of scientific thought. In his terms, sort of 2 strategic levels which are accessible to scientific inquiry. And the concept of levels here is a masterstroke, because instead of saying there's a great divide between us and them, those tribals over there which don't understand nature and just live in it, and we who have science, He's saying they're both scientific thought. They're both strategic levels of apprehending nature. The first level, which is associated with customary peoples across the world, is the perceptive imaginative. That is the science of the concrete. I'll develop that in a second. The second, associated with modern peoples, and particularly technicians and intellectuals, is conceptual, the science of the abstract. So you've got the science of the concrete versus the science of the abstract. Now, it doesn't quite work because it's too dualistic and it doesn't get the complexity of the world. But what he's doing is breaking the great divide as sort of a value judgment. We are complex and they are not. Because perceptive or perceptual imagination is incredibly complicated. And this science of the concrete, he goes into great detail. And what he shows, he uses the example, analogy of bricoleur. The French idea of the bricoleur is a person like a tradesperson who works with the objects around them, working with signs rather than concepts. He works with objects they can pick up in the landscape rather than with concepts they put into a framework which is beyond them. They're inspired by heterogeneous but nevertheless relatively closed universe of instruments and meanings, as opposed to the modern layer of knowledge, ontologically different, which tends to be developed akin to the work of engineers who use techniques and concepts that reach for an open universe of possibilities. So what I've used the term tends to be here to emphasize Levi-Strauss is not in practice posing an absolute distinction, but rather a generalizing difference between two ontologically different ways of knowing the world. They are levels of apprehension, one more concrete, one more abstract. They're ways of knowing, and each are a part of a larger ontological set of differences. I think this insight is quite critical. A little later on, I'll use a similar move to talk about ontological formations. But for the moment, we're just trying to get away from the idea that pre-modern societies are simple and modern societies are complex, conceptual, and we are sophisticated and they're not. So that's enough to set up that starting point. The next author is Marilyn Strathern, brilliant anthropologist. She wrote a book called The Gender of the Gift in 1988. And she draws out previous work which distinguishes ontologically between the gift and the commodity. Now, it's very simple in a sense, and this goes back to Marx, that is, the commodity abstracts from the person. When you buy something from someone in a shop, you don't care who the other person is you're buying from. You don't care who you order something through the internet and it comes by a post through a courier. You don't care who the person who delivers it to. But with the gift, even in modern society, but residually so, the gift, it matters who gives it to you. And in anthropology, gift exchange is a central form to customary society. So Marilyn Strathern builds upon this long-held affirmation, going back as far as Marx's insight, that the commodity is a social relation. The commodity names a relationship between people which is more abstract, where they no longer need the particularity of that person, they abstract the relation. And objects, therefore, like gifts and commodities, are ontologically different social things. They exist in and contribute to the nature of different kinds of sociality. So that's what Marilyn Strathern is taking from it. But she goes one more step. What she shows in customary cultures of Melanesia is that the predominant form of knowledge, not dissimilar to what Levi-Strauss is doing, is not cumulative like in modern settings, like the engineer, but recursively known in its performance or its enacting, like the bricoleur. That is, the predominant form of knowledge is different from modern settings. That's all you really need to hold on to. The predominant form of exchange is also different from modern forms of exchange. It's not possessive or possessed, but it's reciprocally understood in its non-quantifiable expression as relational. That is embodied relational, not abstract relational. And here's the beauty of her move, the predominant form of gendered identity is not unitary, as in modern and unifying, like you are male, but it's lived in relation to its enacting under particular circumstances. Now, each of these things, the knowledge, the exchange, and gender, are analogical with each other. In other words, and this is my words, knowledge, exchange, and gender are here socially related as pattern practices in a particular ontological formation, namely the customary. Now, she doesn't say that exactly, but she sets up those first steps that I was talking about. One more person. I'm going to add in Eduardo Vitros de Castro. He's the third marker in our genealogical story. And he writes this much discussed essay where he writes of animism and what I would call a customary imaginary. And he says it's peopled by different kinds of subjective agencies, that is, humans as well as non-humans, each endowed with the same generic type of soul. Now, animals and humans have the same soul. Put it more graphically, and this is him talking. Animals see the world in the same way as humans. However, what they see, what the animal sees, differs from what the human sees. That is because they have different bodies. And when you go back to the way in which Marilyn Strathern was talking, different enacted ways of seeing, in a way, the body makes a difference. To use his example, whereas humans see blood seeping from a slain animal. So a person has walked into the jungle and they see a dead animal blowing on the ground with blood seeping from. In Viveros de Castro's terms, jaguars see a heady brew, a good drink, manioc beer in his terms. Manioc beer is just a local beer that's made within Latin America from particular kinds of alcohol forms. Now, the customary imaginary is therefore ontologically different from a modern imaginary, namely naturalism, in which treats humans and animals as pushed to different sides of a nature-culture divide. And I'm saying this importantly because this is the step which I really like, but we get another step which goes beyond it, which I think destroys the idea of ontological difference. The ontological turn up till now, up to this point of Viveros de Castro, is setting up a divide which is relative, but it still shows difference across different forms. It's not flattening out the ontology so that humans and animals are the same thing. What he's saying here is that for customary people, the human sees the same way as animals. For modern people, we don't say that. We don't say that humans see the same way as animals. So it's an ontological difference. So in the same way that Marilyn Strathern said the gift is ontologically different to commodity, what Viveros de Castro is saying is that animism is ontologically different from naturalism. So in effect, to summarize this first part of the discussion in that part, as the ontological term gets increasingly taken up by different approaches, we're getting some fantastic insight into the complexity of understanding the human condition. But something shifts, and I'm going to blame it on Bruno Latour, but he's only one figure in a large shift that occurs, because actor network theory, posthumanism, object-oriented ontology, all these things lose this insightful dialectic of difference and identity, this insightful difference that shows ontological continuity and discontinuity, both between animals and different kinds of humans. And what happens, and it's my view, so don't take it as given, you have to think about it yourself. Bruno Latour and all those other different approaches, actor network theory, posthumanism, object-oriented ontology, flatten ontology into the singular ontology, which doesn't make a difference anymore. So actor ontology, actor network theory, has some virtues. For example, it puts a non-hierarchical theoretical view of human, non-human relations. But what Bruno Latour's conception of human-made objects as hybrid actors does, just as his idea that humans are always already hybrids, opens the way to fairly heavy counter critique, that he's just flattening the world into a single layer of ontology. So it's not much different to what I suppose that Deleuze and Guattari do, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. They do in A Thousand Plateaus when they talk about rhizome. They're interested in the surface. A rhizome creeps across the surface, the rhizome of a fern. Trees are terrible things because they have roots and deep structures. So me personally, and I'm talking as a critical theorist, I think that the tree metaphor is actually much more useful than the rhizome metaphor. But most postmodernists, post-structuralists, tend to work with the rhizome metaphor. Latour tends to work, René Latour works with a flat, not a rhizome metaphor, but a network metaphor. Everything is on one level and everything is connected to everything else by lines of networks. Now, the bit of this is shuffled aside in his late stage pivot when he starts to describe the climate change regime, but let's take his dominant approach, which collapses things into one level of ontology. It collapses the categories of human and object into each other in a way that I think is politically dangerous. And we can do it in terms of, say, the Anthropocene, because he's interested in, say, the ways in which coal and oil act. But an ontology which is layered, which is much more complex than his, would ask, do coal and oil have the same constitutive impact or have the same constitutive force as the way in which humans act? So coal and oil are certainly actants in the human claim that we've entered the age of the Anthropocene, but can they be equally responsible for the Anthropocene? Well, actor network theory and even Latour's later work cannot satisfactorily respond to such questions because they cannot distinguish between those kinds of actions. They cannot distinguish, and therefore a more embedded critical theory, which is concerned about the structures of those things, the ways in which humans act in history, can do that. So firstly, by collapsing the ontological status for humans in coal, the Anthropocene just becomes a neutral descriptive category with no agent to take responsibility for it. In fact, humans, I think, and particularly humans, are particularly responsible. And second, through an unintended anthropomorphism, things get often too domesticated as quasi-humans, so disguising what some people have called their thingly otherness. So the conclusion of all this, it means that while we need to recognize that ontological being, both organic and inorganic, is constitutively enmeshed in human being, so it's recursively also part of the Anthropocene, it's equally important, arguing against Latour, that the process of that recognition, we do not flatten the world, either the ontological meaning of social relations in relation to nature or the ontologically different ways of living in and with nature. And so for all the recognition, for all those different methods, recognition of otherness, this is precisely the effect of actor network theory and the new humanism, the new materialism, object-oriented approaches. They flatten ontological difference, and therefore they make otherness, in my terms, meaningless. So let's go to part 4. I'm now going to try and pull this together, but set up an alternative approach to understanding ontological formations. Just a little note beforehand, an anthropologist called Mario Blazer, he's trying to understand different ontological formations, and he describes the process as storied performativity. And when he means, and we went back to that definition, remember we had the definition of logos, meaning stories, or what I was describing more generally, imaginaries. This is the starting point for an imaginary approach. There are different ways of telling the story of the time of humans, different formations of knowing and telling. So we're not flattening out telling. It's not that you don't gather in a story group to yarn and say we're being Aboriginal because we are now in a yarning circle. That to be in an Aboriginal yarning circle is ontologically different than just having a yarn. And we're now doing some telling about those differences. I've tried to develop this a bit in a new book called Global Crisis and Insecurity, The Human Condition Darkly. And I'll get Malini to send this around to you. I've got a PDF I can send and it'll save you buying the book if that's of any interest. So what I'm doing here in this last section is talking about different formations. And in effect, I'm saying these different formations can be understood in relation to the different ways, different social valences about how categories of existence such as time, space, embodiment, and knowledge are lived. Different valences, in other words, are different existential orientations to questions of relationality and meaning. All we're saying there really is that we're talking about the social relations of meaning and practice. In this approach, they're derived comparatively, and then they're abstracted from across the bewildering plurality of human differences. What I'm trying to take seriously is the dominant patterns of difference about how different peoples tell stories, describe their own worlds, including through different translators, anthropological translators, social theory translators, and so on. So I'm working here with 4 different ontological formations: the customary, the traditional, the modern, and the postmodern. Now, in saying there are 4, I don't mean to say that there are actually 4. I'm saying it's useful to describe 4 found formations because we can usefully make sense of the complexity of the world by describing it that way. It's an analytical tool. So let's start with the customary. The customary is defined by the way in which, firstly, analogical, second, geological, and thirdly, mythological valences come to constitute the social practices and meaning in relation to basic categories of existence. That's a very complex thing to say, probably. Let me try and make sense of it. Analogically means in customary societies, the way in which people understand and practice their world is analogical. It's analogous to nature. There's no separation between culture and nature. Nature and culture are bound up with each other. And analogically, when you think about the world is you, and you're trying to work it out through being in the world and what Levi-Strauss called the perceptual understanding of the world. Your senses are primary, and you're looking at the world, you're seeing its seasons, you're seeing things change, and what happens in that world helps you to understand differences in the world. Genealogical just means it's about kinship. It's about your relationships to others. So it's about who your mother and father are, your uncle and auntie, your cousins. Now there'll be different terms in different cultures, but those different terms of embodied connection become the key. And mythological just means the stories you tell about that. Now, mythological myths are singular stories. They're not coherent, brought together. They're singular stories which make sense in the practice of the time. And in this sense, they become the way in which, and you can see within Aboriginal cultures why storytelling is so important, because mythological framing is central to understanding that. And different stories are told about different things, about what happens in nature, what happens to persons, the genealogical and the analogical. In communities where customary is still dominant, such as Indigenous and First Nations peoples, the category of time gives us example. Time is bound genealogically. That is, it's bound into embodied generational succession. Time doesn't just float free as the abstract thing which you fill like a calendar, you put marks. Calendar, there's no calendar in this world. It's marked by people's lives, ritual moments, deaths. And it's marked by seasonal and natural change analogically. And then it's elaborated. How is it elaborated? Through stories, abiding stories, mythologies. And these tell stories about the meaning of these genealogical and analogical relations. So in this form, time is not linear, which is a characteristic of modern time, but it's not circular either, as many commentators try and metaphorically claim about customary societies. Circular time is more related to some traditional cosmologies, such as Hinduism or Tantric Buddhism, but time in this form condenses past, present, and future into the always present past and future, the always present present. So if you can see that it's incredibly complex, it's not simple. We're talking about complexities, and all these things mean that we need to take them seriously. Now, across the long reach of human history, now talking in modern time, these particular ways of understanding time, space, environment, bodies, were dominant and were dominant for most of the time we existed on the planet. For half a millennium ago, modern ways of being were scarcely relevant. 200 years ago, we started to get a marginal exception to this, which was extended by a panoply of processes associated with globalization, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, universalization, westernization, and so on. But for the most part, customary relations were the dominant ways of life across the time that humans have been on planet Earth. And this is a relatively short time, the time of the Anthropocene. This has been fractured. Now, in customary relations, the Anthropocene is not relevant. The impact upon the world is not relevant. It starts to be a little bit when we come to the next category, the traditional, but really it's the modern which brings in our discussion of the Anthropocene. Let's move to the traditional. The traditional, as an ontological formation, has many continuities with the customary, but also involves a qualitative break. So these things which we've just been talking about, these perceptual valences of the customary, they're reconstituted through a cosmological and metaphorical reframing. Now that sounds complicated too. It just means, let's take the metaphorical reframing. What it does, it takes those things which customary people describe and it encloses them, it abstracts from them in relation to the beyond. It puts them in an enclosing thing, the city of man, the body of politics, the civitas, the res publica, Christianity, Christiana, these things, they take it and they reframe all those things in terms of God's presence. Or Buddhism reframes it in terms of time in relation to being. So an orientation toward the cosmological abstracts these basic categories of existence in relation to something else immanent and beyond, which means God, nature, form, time, being with a capital B. So the multiple times of the body and the engaged nature of customary society are generalized into an integrated realm of time. The multiple myths, which are so central to customary societies, they're variously discarded, rewritten, but they're drawn together into universalizing cosmologies. That's what the Bible is. It's full of stories which are taken from older tribal understandings of time and place and embodiment, and they put a cosmological frame around it. And then they start to think about it in terms of God. The modern. Well, you live in the modern. The modern is the dominant form of our society, and yet we take for granted the ontological frame. And you can do it in terms of time, really. The modern is constructivist. It reframes all those prior social practices and meaning in terms of the idea that humans are constructors. In this context, time stretches from the past into the future. It becomes empty, abstracted time as we project a line of progress, for example. Time as progress. Now, it's a very going forward. All these metaphors which we take for granted are not part of earlier formations. The medieval is not person, is framed by an idea of eschatologies of time, which say there are things in the future, including the end of time, but they're not always thinking about stepping forward. To go backward for us is a bad thing. To be caught and not be able to go in progress, to be not free to progress. Wow, but you can see how these become ideologies of the present as well. So the dominant orientation of our time is this reflexive, relentless drive to construct and progressively remake the world, nature, and us. This is what brings about the Anthropocene. Thus we find ourselves having no choice but to choose and to re-choose what our relationship to nature should look like. You have no choice. You will have to choose your relationship to nature. You will have to choose your relationship now even to gender, as I talk about it further on. But this sociology, this social imaginary of modern progress is tied to capitalism, and it's tied to the process of commodification and codification. That is the way in which human impact upon this planet increases exponentially, and the way in which we measure its increase exponentially. These modern formations have become colonizing and globalizing. Doesn't mean it's everywhere and everything. That's to homogenize it falsely. Remember, we had Mario Blazer talking about the nature of modernity before. We don't want to say that um, there's not difference within modernity. It's just the difference is framed by this modern ontology. And this should be kept to the fore in understanding all these other formations. They come into intersection with each other, and they have tensions within themselves. And let's go lastly to the postmodern. The most recent of these formations to emerge in modern history, the postmodern. What it does, the major valence of this is its relativizing tendency. It relativizes all these other less abstract orientations. Even what I was describing before as analogical or genealogical or mythological valence has become grist to the mill of postmodern writers and proponents. No wonder they emphasize storytelling and animated nature so much. Someone like Donna Haraway now is talking about the way in which, say, storytelling is the key to what she does. But she's doing a different kind of storytelling. She's doing a relativizing storytelling. When somebody talks about animated nature from a post-materialist or a new materialist position, what they're talking about is different from what a customary person means by animated nature. So time, the past, the future, and nature become relative to the position of the experiencing subject. Now, I can do that in relation to time easily because everybody knows Einstein's theory of relativity, relativizing time. That's what he's doing. He makes it a scientific truth. Once time itself becomes relative to the movement or the frame of reference of the observer. So at one level, modern time, it's still being measured. It's getting ever more precise. We're doing it through the cesium atom, and we're trying to measure the length of a day down to microseconds. And the optical clocks of the 2020s are so precise that they're unbelievable, but they're unsettled by nearly a century of the shifting sands of postmodern relative time described by Einstein, because they always have to keep adjusting those clocks, not just for the way in which the Earth is changing on its axis or the way in which time is shifting, but time in the postmodern sense is always differentially moving and changing. Nature, in the same way, is what we make of it. Thus, the modern ideal of progress becomes shaky, but the Promethean drive of human impact is actually materially redoubled. Witness the role of theory of relativity in developing the atomic bomb. So for all this relativization, it's in fact framed by a relationship to nature becomes increasingly contingent. So we're developing the technologies. Technoscience intersects with cybernetic control. And the task of reconstituting the very building blocks of nature, I was describing this before in relation to the Anthropocene, atoms, molecules, cells, genes, hormones, and so on, is accelerated. Now, Donna Haraway, for my point, becomes an ideologue of that very process, particularly when she's talking about cyborgs. She writes a thing called the Manifesto for Cyborgs. She flattens the ontology of humans in relation to technologies and says, we're all just cyborgs now, we're all just machines. There is a difference. I'm not wanting to say there's a vast, great divide. I'm saying, but there is an ontological difference which is important. And once you don't allow us to see that, every object just becomes a standing reserve of exploitable matter, including humans. So let me try now draw this to a conclusion. I've outlined a method for recognizing different registers of practice and meaning ontologically. I've documented different ontological differences and shown how you can relate different ontological ways in which different peoples describe the basic meanings of their existence. And as part of this, I've defined what I've described as ontological formations. What this means is the thing called modernity is an ontological formation. It's not an epoch, singular, marked, time marked, distinct from other formations. It's a dominant form in which tribal, customary, traditional ways of understanding are still relevant to today, still absolutely relevant. But we don't treat them as coming before, we treat them as coextensive with and in contradiction to. That is, even if we can discern periods of ontological difference across human history, these periods cannot be just simply treated as great epochs progressively replacing each other. There's no great line of progress. This climb is a dominant modernist story. And at least in the present period, ontological formations are coexistent, layered, constitutive ways of being, and across history, they have often been lived relationally in tension. And really, if I was to put in a political point at this stage, although there was a politics in relation to theory earlier, I suppose, in relation to my critique of flat ontologies, it would be what we need to do politically is relationally find a new balance between a more embodied sense of relating to others, telling stories about others, living in genealogical connection to others or in analogical connection to nature, at the same time as negotiating what it means to have more abstract connections to others. It's an incredibly complex area, but ontology in the end is about the human existence. Thanks.